Jenny Proimos works with young people in her role as an adolescent health physician in the Department of Adolescent Medicine at the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne. Jenny has a background in public policy and spent a decade working in the Victorian Government as the Chief Advisor on child and adolescent health. Is that correct?
Yep, you don't have to say all that.
She's the current president of the Academy of Child and Adolescent Health. Little known fact, she was once the lead singer of a French punk rock cover band and played gigs in Paris and throughout France, and will do requests tonight at the party. She doesn't know about that part.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you to the Bubbles team for inviting me to speak. I actually am really honoured to be wearing this T-shirt today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Yagara and the Turrbal people of Meanjin, the Aboriginal name for Brisbane. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to extend that respect to any First Nations people in the audience today. This painting sits on our wall at home, and it's taught my family about colonialism and dispossession and the use of the European language as it's been weaponised to embed systemic and casual racism against First Nations people. And this is my dad. My dad immigrated to Australia when he was 30, seeking a better life from financial poverty back in Greece. And my dad always used to say to me, when he was about to start on one of his very long, sort of historical stories about the past, was that you don't know where you're going until you know where you've been. And so what I want to do today as we talk about the maturation of adolescent health in Australia is take you back on a journey to the history of child and adolescent health from the ages and see what we can learn, what pearls of wisdom we can learn from the past to inform our future as we move forward. Because adolescent health is certainly not mature in Australia yet. So let me take you to the beginning of the 20th century. Children were still dying in significant numbers of mainly infectious diseases and industrial accidents. Many of them were working to supplement their family's income. Many were not attending school. And a series of welfare reforms trying to embed sort of the labour, or trying to embed better protections for children sort of occurred in the 30s. At that stage, at the turn of the century, paediatrics as a discipline did not exist. From the late 19th century, there was still a bit of suspicion about quacks and the type of medicine they did, and the universities didn't believe the specialties had enough knowledge and enough strength in their curriculum to teach them. And it wasn't really until the 1930s that paediatrics became a discipline. And the early paediatricians were very clear that they were actually generalists specialists. That's what they called themselves. So child health developed as a discipline of breadth rather than of depth. And already we're starting to see the tension between paediatricians who were defined by an age of specialty versus the organ-based specialists who saw themselves as more important, more capable, reminding us of the work that Ben talked about yesterday, the difference between how power is allocated to depth versus breadth. So as we get through the 30s, we get to World War II, we saw that young people were failing a lot of their recruitments in their physical examinations for being recruited into the army. And a number of paediatricians were talking about the forgotten children. These young people had a whole lot of medical and social and emotional disorders that really hadn't been picked up. And after World War II, came some affluence, some rebound affluence in the world. By this stage, paediatrics was well established as a discipline, and it was actually morphing into two different specialties. It was morphing into the acute paediatrics in the big tertiary-based hospitals, and into this concept of new paediatrics, where we had children and young people being seen by paediatricians in their offices and in their private rooms that really had more developmental and behavioural disorders. And the concept of neurodevelopmental and behavioural paediatrics was morphed out of that difference. And so that tension between the depth of acute paediatrics and the breadth of the new paediatrics also started to play out within the paediatric field itself. So post-World War II, bit of affluence, and the middle classes started to emerge. And based on what the experience had been, seeing the power of young people and the passion of young people harnessed in such a difficult and evil way by the Third Reich, there was a real backlash against the concept of adolescence moving to adulthood, and there was a real sense that we needed to protect and care for them and really try and keep them as children for as long as we could. And so the middle-class children were going to schools. There were now law reforms that sort of meant that school was easier to access. And the lower-class kids were going to dance clubs, and they were going to cinemas, and they were going to amusement parks. And the middle-class kids kind of went, well, hang on, that looks like fun to me. Why aren't we doing that? And they too went to the dance clubs and the amusement parks and the cinemas. And the academic world, kind of went a bit ballistic about this. They're like, oh my God, this adolescent rebellion, how are we going to fix this? We don't know what's happening to our children. This is so difficult. In fact, this was when Erikson, who we all know, emerged. And Erikson was the one who said, hang on, this is probably a developmental phase that we know that young people need to go through to start to separate from their families, to start to separate from their elders, to relate to their peers, and really it's a step on the way to healthy, adult development. And so for the first time, the concept of adolescent development was actually normalised in the practice of paediatrics and child health. Now, many people argue that adolescence is a sort of a Western social construct of the 20th century. But in fact, it's been around forever. And we know that it's been around forever. And Hesiod, who was a Greek poet, the first ancient Greek poet, the first written poetry that is known to man, actually said, I see no hope for the future of our people if they are dependent on the frivolous youth of today. For certainly all youth are reckless beyond words. When I was a boy, we were taught to be discreet and respectful of elders, but the present youth are exceedingly wise and impatient of restraint. So as we can see, adolescence has been around for a very long time. And it was in this milieu and in this context of the middle classes emerging that the first adolescent unit was built at the Children's Hospital in Boston in 1951. Charles Janeway, who was the grandson of the original Janeway, who developed the Janeway lesions that we all learnt about in an infective endocarditis, was the chief of medicine at the time, and he used adolescent. He was actually quite prescient and recognised the importance and the value of dealing with adolescents. Paediatricians had long been saying children are not little adults, but nobody was really talking about the needs of young people. And Charles Janeway recognised that this was a good opportunity to actually expand the breadth of the Children's Hospital in Boston and raise the age from 12 up to 18. And he hired a guy called J. Roswell Gallagher to be his first adolescent physician. Ros Gallagher came from the school health services. And he worked in a military academy. And so he had a really strong depth of understanding of the broad issues that touch young people, having managed them for a number of years before. And Ros Gallagher was also a very canny social marketer. So he knew how to recruit children. He went out to schools, he gave talks, he went to parents' groups, he went to children's groups, he went to boys' clubs and girls' clubs. He wrote articles for school newspapers, arguing the case for why young people need a doctor of their own. And they came. Within 5 years, there was 5,000 cases on their books, and the program grew exponentially. And what J. Roswell Gallagher also did, which was really prescient in many ways and what we can learn from, is that he set the scene for how we manage young people and how we deal with young people right from the beginning of the discipline. So he very openly talked about the importance of respecting young people as partners in their own care. He talked about the importance of giving them confidential health care. Just imagine that in 1951, giving young people confidential health care without their parents knowing. We can barely do that today, let alone 70 years ago. He spent a lot of time talking about arranging the physical space so that it was conducive to discussions and conversations with young people, and really that those conversations needed to be open-minded, open-hearted, non-judgmental, and really focusing on the strengths of the young people. And he also talked a lot about making sure that those conversations, and in dealing with a young person, you talked about the whole child, everything that mattered to them, and not just the health condition that they were coming to see you with. And they're all the principles and the basis of adolescent-friendly healthcare that we still talk about today. So Ros Gallagher was very popular. The discipline grew, and it grew, and it grew, and within about 20 years, there were adolescent units sprouting all over the country in the US. And by about the mid-60s, there were probably a quarter of paediatric hospitals had adolescent units, and of those that didn't, about 3/4 of them wanted to have them. So So those programs developed, and then subsequently it started to expand to the rest of the world. And in Australia, we saw the first adolescent physician employed at the Children's Hospital in Camperdown, what was then Camperdown, David Bennett, and we saw the first unit of adolescent health, integrated unit, developed in Melbourne in 1992. And that was directed by Professor Glenn Bowes. And that unit was really integrated, multidisciplinary, had clinical services as well as education and research as its main aim. Didn't start in New Zealand until 1994 with Peter Watson, and didn't start in the UK until 1999 with another friend of the Bubbles, Russell Viner, who came to Australia and did a sabbatical as actually a Brisbanean paediatrician and endocrinologist, and went back to the UK and established health services there, adolescent health services there. And so we're seeing, the paediatricians in the adolescent units in the US were struggling to actually gain credibility from their other subspecialist peers. And one of the paediatricians, who's actually one of the significant leaders in the field, describes his unit being called the garbage pail of paediatrics by his colleagues back in the 70s. And he led he actually ended up leading Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, so a significant leader in the field. And so in Australia, we came to it with this scepticism, this lack of understanding about why adolescent medicine is important, why adolescent health matters as a discipline and as a specialty. Nevertheless, we agitated, we grew it, and it stayed really the purview of New South Wales and Victoria for a long time. And we recognised that in order for it to grow, we really need to train more physicians and more paediatricians to be adolescent friendly. And this is where the college comes in. The College of Physicians, at the time I was the president of the paediatric division, which Nitin currently is now, and Susan Sawyer, who works at the Children's Hospital and has been my old boss, was agitating a lot to develop a training program and to develop it as a subspecialty. And it took a lot of work, it gave me a lot of grey hair, it took a lot of negotiation and a lot of debate with the adult division to convince them that the value was there. And it was really only in framing it as adolescent and young adult medicine and focusing on transition to adult services that we were able to get them across the line to establish a joint committee between the two divisions to talk about developing a training program. Fast forward 10 years and they finally developed a training program which was rolled out in 2017. But what we had done in the meantime was establish a language and a shared understanding through policies that talked about confidentiality of healthcare, that talked about the importance of a psychosocial assessment and how to talk to young people, the importance of sexual and reproductive health, and the importance of transition to adult healthcare. And we aimed very long and very hard at the time to talk about why we must actually have this AMC accredited, American Medical Council, Australian Medical Council accredited, and were shot down in flames. It wasn't allowed. The training program has now been going for about 5 years. It's about to be evaluated, and the college has committed to considering an application to the AMC to gain subspecialist accreditation after that process. So the question would be, why do we want subspecialist accreditation so much when actually it's a discipline of breadth and not depth? And we know that the Australian medical workforce strategy came out last year that talked and highlighted the importance of generalists rather than specialists. The reason why we need that subspecialty sort of accreditation is really because we need to grow a set of leaders in the field. Those leaders can be the ones that take on the responsibility for training the rest of the sector. We know that there are lots of subspecialists in the field who see young people who have a range of different conditions that during their adolescence actually change because of the physical development needs and their growth. We know that there are a lot of conditions that actually emerge in adolescence, so they're important for a number of subspecialists to actually be competent in adolescent health. And we know that all of us see young people coming through our doors, whether it be in our clinics, our private rooms, our offices and outpatients in hospital, our emergency departments or our wards. And so we all have to have a certain level of competence in working with young people. And so what I'd like to challenge you about today, and at the risk of telling you to suck eggs, because I know that this is pretty basic, is to go back to those adolescent health principles that Ros Gallagher taught us so many years ago and review how you approach young people. Are you open, non-judgmental? Do you come to those relationships and those interactions with young people with a curious mindset? Do you come to it with a strengths-based focus? Sometimes these young people have nobody in their corner that looks at them as something that's worthwhile other than you as their advocate and their doctor. So how do you come to them and say, let's find something that's actually great about you and let's work on that, when everything else is just falling apart. How do you hold that uncertainty for those young people? How do you actually get them to talk and not just answer yes, no, or walk out of the room or stump out of the room when you ask them to do something that they don't want to do? How do you use the psychosocial assessment to be able to actually bring them in and engage them in a conversation? Young people can pick bullshit anywhere. So young people need to recognise that you are in their court and you have their back and that you respect them and that you actually are, really genuinely partnering with them in their healthcare journey. And they might not like what you say, but they'll accept the fact that and they'll respect the fact that you say it. And so that ability to actually come in with that non-judgmental, positive frame is really, really crucial. And how do you get used to asking for pronouns? We know that gender diversity has increased exponentially, and it's happening globally, and it's going to continue to happen as the concept becomes destigmatised and we see the numbers increase until eventually they will plateau at some point in the future that we can't predict at this point. So get used to asking young people about their pronouns and using them respectfully. And if you make a mistake, apologise and go back. They won't mind. They just want to know that you've made the effort. I'm not going to talk about transition because I know that Jane is going to give a talk about later in the day, but think about transition and think about it early. How do we start to develop that shared care between the adult services and young people and frame it for young people so that they start to take responsibility for their own health care and start to make decisions for themselves that when they hit the adult system, they can hit it running and understand how the system works. We know that adolescent health constitutes more than just illness. We know that the young people who are turning up to your emergency departments and turning up to our offices and our wards have a range of different issues. They might be substance using, they might be using a lot of alcohol, they might have issues with mental health. We know that COVID increased the rate of anxiety in our young people exponentially. They might have issues with sexual and reproductive health. They may have issues with over and under nutrition. They may be overweight or they may be underweight. They may have non-accidental or accidental injuries. And they may be perpetrators or victims of violence. And if we don't ask the questions, we won't find out when they turn up to our emergency departments with the broken arm. And I just want to finally remind you that what we think is the aim of a therapeutic encounter might not be what young people think is the aim of a therapeutic encounter. Young people have all sorts of needs going on in their lives. And when we ask them to go and fill out a prescription and get the pharmacy and take those medications twice a day, we might not recognise that their parents are their mother is at home in bed with a significant mental illness, who doesn't have a job, they have no money, who doesn't cook meals, and who the young person is caring for. We need to think about them in their broader context of their family, their school, their peer group, and the social construct in which they live their lives, and address some of those needs before we can address some of the needs of their health issue. So I'm not going to bother you with heads other than to say it's important that you think about social media and social media use when you're talking to young people, because it's something that they have grown up with and is part of them and ubiquitous to them, but it's not something that we've grown up with and that we're necessarily comfortable with. And I'm really heartened by the fact that heads has been adapted in different places and for different circumstances, and in emergency departments used as something that physicians can use to actually actively plan discharge for young people in a way that is considered and thoughtful. So what can we learn from going back in time and history? Well, we can learn that tension between generalists and specialists has always existed and may probably always will unless we do something about changing that culture. We've learned that the principles of adolescent health were established back in the 1950s and really haven't changed. That notion of respect and looking after young people and caring for them and having their backs is really what matters in establishing a good, strong therapeutic relationship. We've learnt that paediatrics did a lot of really good advocacy work to try and raise the health and well-being of children and young people. And I am sure we'll continue to do a lot of good work advocacy-wise for both young people and children. And so, in conclusion, aren't we lucky to be living in a time when our children are not the canaries in the coal mine, but in fact have the agency and the passion and the willingness and the voice to be able to be strong advocates for their own futures and what they believe in? Thank you. I feel we're very lucky, and I think the future is very bright. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jenny. We probably only have time for one or two questions. We've got a roving mic out there somewhere, and it's actually also a reminder to me to ask the people sitting on the ends of the rows, can you squish towards the middle, please? So we can have a little bit of shuffling at this time as well, because there aren't that many spare seats that are along the rows. In you go, everybody. While we're trying to find a question, one for you, Jenny, if I may. You seem to be a very young subspecialty in terms of when it's been established as an official subspecialty.
It's in its early adolescence in Australia, is how I put it.
I was going to ask, are there parallels between adolescence and the adolescent phase of a new organisation?
Yeah, so in my view, the adolescent medical discipline in Australia is currently really sitting in early adolescence. It's hit a growth spurt, and the College of Physicians has done a great job of growing more adolescent leaders. And I do have to acknowledge that Henry, who's in the room, is one of the adolescent leaders that it has grown in recent times, and I think is going to be an enormous asset to the discipline. And it's about to hit a Bolshoi phase, I suspect. It's about to hit that middle adolescent phase where we're going to have to start the arguments again with the college. I mean, the initial arguments to get adolescent on the agenda at the college gave me grey hair, literally. Like literally the first grey hairs I saw. And I suspect we're going to have that same conversation this next phase to try and gain that credibility and that next step to get the college to take it through the AMC process, which is a long, drawn-out, difficult and very expensive one.
Okay, I suspect that Claire will be thinking a bit the same about the emergency college as well.
There's no questions from Twitter, but there is a great debate about what the collective noun for presidents is. So far, we have an impeachment of presidents. I don't think that applies. I think the real one is a succession of presidents. But so far, the agreed upon noun for this group is a trust of presidents.
Aww.